All rise. Please be seated.
All right, Mr. Witness, where is he?
He's right here, Your Honor. It is now the time that we should argue about states on the timeline video.
I don't think so. The next time the jury would see it would be during deliberations, if it's admitted, right?
Yes, sir.
Right.
I didn't know if there's something I need to add to have it admitted as substantive evidence.
I don't know. I mean, you've offered it, and I've said it's for ID purposes only at this point. And we're in the midst of dealing with the witness, so we can talk about it another time, I imagine. Bring the jury. Where's Mr.?
He's here.
Oh. Hiding behind the screen there. You have to resume your seat, I believe.
Actually, I've got some questions to ask.
Oh, all right. You're still down there. Okay.
Just step up there. That's good. Sorry.
All jurors present, Your Honor.
Okay. You may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. I just have a few more questions. Your Honor, this time, I'll ask to publish States 13, which was introduced through Brian Childs. And if we could have the sound turned on. Mr. Williams, I'm going to ask you to, I don't believe you've seen Mr. Giles' presentation that was.
Not
that
yet.
happened. You have sound in? Now, Mr. Williams, regarding the syncing that you did, at the start of the red cone 1 for the first taser activation.
Yes.
You did not use that area as an anchor point, correct?
No.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to go to that area on your timeline, which is State's Exhibit 245 for identification right now. Let me ask you this before you even start playing. You have this playing, you have this playing through QuickTime.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And to advance QuickTime with your timeline, does the arrow key work like?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can pull the slider to jump to a specific time, scrub it.
Okay. If you could go to just when the animation has the two men turning the corner onto the yellow brick road.
Up there.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
And if you could play that section through where you have to mark the Taser 1 activation.
Okay. Tell me when you're ready.
Okay? Okay. So, you said you didn't anchor those two noises at the beginning,
No.
but they somehow line up. How did that happen? That the pop of the firing of the taser, how did that sync up with your red cone area if you didn't?
I think it's a verification that we have a pretty darn close alignment of everything.
Okay. You used other audio to anchor, not that taser sound and taser time.
Only the two voice ones that we discussed earlier were my
I'm
anchor.
sorry.
Only the two voice portions we discussed earlier were my anchor points.
Okay. And then if we could go, if you could slide forward to just past taser 5. So a little bit forward that. Okay.
Right there?
A little bit further before we get to the Santana video.
Okay.
Back up, video.
So you wanted to
Go
start
to
it?
where the 3 seconds is right there.
Okay.
So,
Right there? Right there? Okay.
all right, so this was at 9:37:32, and shortly after this, the Santana video comes into,
Yeah, within seconds. I mean,
Okay,
at least
and-
3 seconds and a couple more.
and you have taser 6 lit up. Not now, but when that gets there.
Yes.
Okay, if you could play that section through the intro of Santana's video.
Everybody ready?
That should be across, correct?
Remount Road next to the Money Man and the fire station.
Back that up one more time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have taser 6 being activated before we see Santana's video.
I do.
Okay, and why was that?
The ticking on the Santana video I'm taking as the end of Taser 6.
Okay. Based on, if you had taken that as being the first part of the tasing, it would have,
You would have seen what we just heard earlier, the offset by that time.
and run up into the shooting.
It wouldn't be that far, but yeah, it would
Run
push
out
everything
further.
forward.
Okay, push everything forward, okay. Play that again.
That should be across the creek.
Remount Road next to the Money Man and the fire station.
Let the person go. Mr. Williams, if you could have a seat back up there and
Can we
answer
close
any,
this down?
Mr. McHugh, do you need that?
I will, but not right now.
Okay.
If we could move it out of the way so that the judge can, so that everyone can observe everything, because I would like to be able to
Move what?
just move the podium around to make sure that I can get to his, I'm not going to interfere with his audio visuals.
All right, Mr. McHugh.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Watts.
Good afternoon.
We talked a bit yesterday, and you had a chance to explain to the jury today a little bit about your background and the work you did in this case. I believe you said that really what the solicitor wanted to get from you, bottom line, was a distance when shots were fired between Officer Slager and Mr. Scott. Is that correct?
Well, that was one of the things I was asked to do, yes.
And you said that you've had experience in scene recreation. You haven't had any training in crime forensic analysis, right?
No, sir.
But you went to the scene. Did you survey the scene when you arrived?
No, there's a Faro scan that basically is a survey. So if I needed to pull some measurements, I could actually use the Faro for that. You can pull an electronic tape in it. So no, I didn't survey it.
And but you would have relied on the Faro scan for those measurements that you needed if you needed some measurements for that purpose.
I would at least at the very least start there. I may verify that when I'm at the scene and pull an actual tape or do a laser distance or something like that, depending on what I was measuring.
Okay. And during your animation, you have figures running down Craig Road and turning right down what's been termed the Yellow Brick Road, correct?
Yes.
And how did you sequence those people along the road without a measurement of distance and time?
Well, by taking the start of the event at the in-car video, I think it's 3609, as your start point, locating taser 1 at, I think it's 3629, I may be off, but that is a fixed point in time. There's a fixed distance there, it's about 300 feet, okay? So using average speeds to transverse that distance, I assign that to both Mr. Scott and Mr. Slager, and then determine the gap between the two by, if you look at Mr. Scott leaving the in-car video, I think it's about at 12 or so, but if you look, he's going to transition to the animation, and then I used Mr. Slager's, when you start to hear the jiggling of the belt, that's pretty much the start of when he's starting to run. And they're not meant to be, hey, that's where those two gentlemen were in that animation or in the incident. They're just visual representations that they transverse this distance and this time. Did they speed up, slow down? Was that their gait? Did they move their arms? That's not the purpose of that.
And you had testified earlier that you once saw a video where people were moving at 51 miles an hour, is that correct?
Well, luckily they didn't animate that. It had to be pulled out of their still drawing. But yeah, 51 miles an hour, yeah.
And did you do any calculations at what speed these people were traveling at down the road?
I did, and if I recall, it's in the low teens.
But that's just based on strictly time and distance with no regard to their actual position at any time along the route, other than, as you say, you think you know where one of the tasers was deployed, based on the evidence marked by SLED.
Yes.
And do you have any experience, you don't have any experience in taser deployment as far as the normal pattern for the spread of aphids?
Well, not formal training, no.
Okay,
Personal, yes.
And what about the doors themselves, the taser doors that are ejected? You can't say with certainty what range those would have landed in, correct?
Well, I've done, again, testing of my own. I haven't been to Taser International, their testing. I've reviewed slow motion videos and stuff like that. So I have an idea based on what I've done personally, but I'm not going to testify this is the range.
Okay. And in fact, as was pointed out in your videos, there were a couple of vehicles that went down the road that very well could have disrupted that scene before SLED was able to get there and mark it, correct?
Well, it's possible that some of the objects that we talked about are not in the same position as they were when it actually took place.
Okay, and so when you arrived at the scene, you have talked a little bit about the SLED measurements.
I have.
And did you use the SLED measurements to place your markers, your YSAT markers?
Well, as I think I discussed, we use the SLED measurements to get the rough in point. So we pulled the distances from the poles, we dropped it, we put it there, we took a closer look at the scene photos and saw that they didn't line up. So we took it the next step, as I discussed in length.
And by didn't line up, off a little bit, off a lot, did it vary?
It seemed to be at least somewhat consistent in that it seemed that the majority of the markers would move away from the poles. So they moved towards the alleyway, and I'm not sure if they shifted, maybe shifted towards Craig Street, but there was a pattern there. We didn't try and analyze it. There was a general pattern.
And you know if, when SLED was at the crime scene, if they put markers on the poles that they could use to take their measurements from?
I'm not aware of that. What we were told is that it was approximate. They couldn't tell us the exact reference on the poles, whether it's the center of the pole or the outer diameter of the pole. So there's some estimation or approximation in there.
Okay, and when you took your measurements, you used a tripod, a plumb bob, and a specific height?
Yeah, you saw it in the photographs. It's not quite probably 3 foot or so.
But you don't know if that's exactly what SLED did. You were off on your own creating that database, more or less.
Well, we weren't, again, that piece of information wasn't documented. So I didn't know where they were holding their measuring device as far as vertical height off the ground.
Did you ever ask them where they took their measurements?
We did.
And who did you ask?
I didn't talk to the person directly. It was like, hey, we would like to know this information, and it was asked to, I think, Agent Brown, I think his name is, the person who did the measurements, and he wasn't able to provide that information.
When you were taking your plumb bob measurements, where do you center your plumb bob? I was unclear. Is it on the piece of evidence in the case of a specific piece of evidence such as a cartridge, or is it on the marker itself?
That was another question we asked is the measurement the actual piece of evidence, or is it the marker? And that couldn't be answered either. So we used the marker as our reference to set the initial position. And then we used the photographs to fine-tune the position of the marker.
And were the markers you were using the same dimensions as the marker SLED used, or do you know?
They appeared to be after we placed it. I did not get my hands on their markers and do a measurement, but based on when you look at the fine-tuning with the rocks and then how far off the little tent extends, it certainly looks like they're substantially similar at the very least.
Okay, so you took those measurements and you used them to assist you in creating the animation, correct?
Yes and no. If you look in the animation, you're not going to see marker 1 or 2 in there. So they weren't, all of them weren't included in that animation. They were done each time as part of the exercise to recreate the scene to be able to do the work we did.
And you've mentioned a Faro scanner, which is, would you describe it again to the jury, what that is?
Well, it's a device, a laser scanner that you would position, you'd put reference objects out in the field, usually spheres, and it would basically do a 3D scan of that area. You'd move it to another position, you'd do a 3D scan, you move it to another one, and then you'd mesh all those scans together to create a virtual 3D environment of that area.
Now, in a perfect world, a Faro scan would be done pretty close to the time of the incident when the evidence had not been displaced or tampered with, correct?
Depending on the circumstances of the whole event, sure.
And you decided to create your own database, and as part of creating that database, you decided to use, I think you said it was either camera matching or reverse projection. Are they the same thing?
They are,
Okay, so camera matching is the same thing as reverse projection.
just a different name for it.
And that's part of a subset of something called photogrammetry, is that correct?
It is.
And would you consider photogrammetry an art or a science?
It's both.
Okay. And have you ever had any formal training in photogrammetry?
I have not.
So do you know if there are any certification agencies for photogrammetry?
I believe there are.
But you're not a member of one of those?
I'm not.
Have you ever taught any classes of photogrammetry?
No, I've not.
And have ever written any papers on photogrammetry?
I've not.
Okay, so you're a self-taught photogrammetrist?
Well, keep in mind there's other ways to apply photogrammetry. The reverse projection is just one little subset of the entire field, and I applied that subset.
Okay, and that subset, you say, is the same as camera match?
In general, yes. You're matching the position, the camera's position at the time the photo or video was taken.
And when you selected frames to camera match, how did you come up with a frame?
I looked at the Santana on-changed or on-enhanced video in a video editor and located shots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and the frames associated with those.
And how did you locate those frames associated with each shot?
By lining up the shot with the wave pattern.
Okay, and what, did you use a Santana unenhanced video to make that alignment?
I did.
And did you align all the shots or just the first shot?
I'm not sure the question.
Okay, there were 7 shots, correct? That you worked on.
Yeah, there are 8 shots, 7 I
Yes.
worked on.
And so you selected a frame
Yes,
to do the matching on. And you used that same frame for each of the shots, is that correct?
no.
So what, did you do a separate match for every shot?
Oh, are you talking about the field work product where I'm matching the camera with the field?
Correct.
Okay, for the compilation, that was, basically, well, we walked through it. I matched shot 1, and then we added a silhouette for each other shot. We matched it to that compilation of shots 1 through 7.
And do you know if the frame you used, what did you say the frame rate is? And it's around 30 frames per
30
second?
frames.
And do you know the difference between a reference frame and a predictive frame in videos?
I do not.
So are you aware that videos, sometimes only video will take forward items that have shown movement so that the frames change from frame to frame? It may be the same information in each frame depending on whether there's any movement.
Okay.
But did you analyze this frame to understand whether it was a predictive frame or a reference frame?
I did not. I looked
Okay.
at it visually.
And when you plotted out then the other positions, did you do the same analysis with them when you were trying to project those onto the frame that you have?
Yeah, I took the frame at the wave where it initiated the shot and chose that frame.
But you then put that frame back on the original.
Yeah, I created that exhibit, I don't know the number in front of me, as I discussed. I used Mr. Slager as the anchor point for each frame added. I kept him in a stationary position because if you watch the video, his feet don't move. So he was my anchor point to create that.
And did you have to add any video, interlace any video or do anything to that reference frame to add all of those figures in there?
Well, basically, as you added the consecutive figure, they would extend. That's why this is longer than the aspect ratio of the original video, because they would extend the length of the image.
So were you stitching together the frames, or how do you lengthen a frame of a video using separate frames?
They're put in layers into an imaging editing program, so you have layer 1 is shot 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, and when they combine, you see the end result at the bottom.
And what is that video program?
Not video, it's basically Photoshop.
It's a Photoshop program, is that what you
It's
used?
Photoshop.
Okay, and do you know how Photoshop aligns those images?
I align them,
You align them.
yes.
And you align them based on pixels, or do you align them based on eyeballing, or how do you align them?
Well, eyeball pixels, yes.
So you do both eyeball and pixels. How many frames did it take to recreate this exhibit with the 7 shots? How many different pieces of frames did you have to use?
There's the 7 frames.
So you took one frame and then stitched another one, and then another one, and then another one, and another one, right?
I did.
And you don't know whether any of those frames were predictive frames or reference frames, correct?
I do not.
Okay. Now, when you got the, let's go back to the beginning of the matching process. You went to the site, and you went to the site and sketched some, what you determined to be fixed objects, correct? Traced them?
Sure.
And how did you decide where to start?
As far as where to start my camera,
Yeah, where to place the camera?
if you watch the video at that portion, you can see the fence, top fence pole and the fence come into view and out of view. And you basically, if you were to try this anywhere, you say, okay, it looks like he's about here, and then you move around until it gets closer and closer, and then you attach the camera to something more rigid so you can control its movement. I use that process.
So, and when you were doing this process, were you viewing through the camera, or were you eyeballing, or how did you get to the point
was
where you
output-
started refining it?
I was outputting to the monitor we saw earlier.
What kind of monitor were you outputting to?
I could probably zoom in on one of the images. It's just a computer monitor.
Was it an LCD monitor, CRT? Do you know what the output was?
I'd have to look.
Do you know if the aspect ratio was the same? Were you getting the same view on your monitor as you were getting on the Santana camera?
I was.
And I think you had, you said you had then you put a transparency?
Yes, the one we saw that I generated for each of the, well, yes.
Okay, and do you know if the transparency changed the image at all? You know, sometimes when you put something in front of a screen, it changes the view that you have.
Through the multiple times I did it, it did not appear when I was looking, put it on, that there's any kind of magnification or distortion or anything like that.
And you kept
Plus,
that?
I'm sorry. I
Go
didn't mean
right
to-
ahead, sorry.
I was also able to view the smaller, albeit smaller, viewfinder on the phone as I was doing this as well, so.
And did you use the phone viewfinder plus the computer monitor, did you cross-check both of those as you were setting your objects?
Primarily the monitor, but the phone was there to be able to look at too.
And then you said you got cutouts or silhouettes.
We made them, yes.
And how did you go about estimating the size of the silhouettes you're going to use?
Well, by looking through the file, I believe Mr. Scott was 5'9". I looked up his height, and then for each of the frames, and he is changing his gait position, I basically took the best distance from his foot to his head that would represent if he was standing upright, and scaled the larger image to that and printed them out on a large format printer.
By best distance from the foot to the head, what? You mean you just took an estimate? What were the dimensions of the silhouettes you used?
They were targeted at the highest point to be the 5'9", representing a foot to top of head in a vertical orientation.
And what about for Officer Slager?
Same thing. Of course, he was just in one position, but yes, I looked up his height and scaled it to that.
And after you scaled those, step us through how you position them again. So you have some scaled silhouettes.
Yes,
You think you have estimated the point where Santana was filming based on trace outlines of stationary objects?
yes,
Okay, and then you place a silhouette out there and adjust the silhouette until it matches what you think the frame looks like?
yes, in essence, yes.
How did you account for lateral offset? Was that done by just eyeballing it for lateral offset?
Yes,
And how about depth?
Control this from there, correct?
No, sir, I cannot.
But if you could control it, you could walk through the scene.
Yes, sir.
And you said that it's about 2 football field lengths, some 393 or something yards from Mr. Slager's vehicle until, what was it, Tell me the
Not
distance.
yards. I'd have to look at the measurements that we just took, but I believe it was 590-something feet.
So about 2 football fields, is that fair? Almost 600 feet.
About.
And you walk through that, right? You showed the jury how to get from Slager's car down to Yellow Brick Road.
Yes,
What
sir.
is the distance before the turnoff on Yellow Brick Road? From the vehicle of Slager to the turnoff going down Yellow Brick Road?
I would have to look at the machine.
But you could tell the jury that, right?
You could get an approximate measurement, correct?
And so then they can get an idea of distance and effort and whatnot, correct?
Yes, sir.
And they could tell how many, if you added audio to it, they could tell how many warnings were given to Mr. Scott prior to Yellow Brick Road.
That would be beyond my scope of adding that in.
Have you talked to Mr. Williams?
This, actually, just a minute ago when we were hooking up the computer, but that's about it.
So he didn't consult with you and try and compare his testimony and your testimony?
No, sir, I viewed his PowerPoint, but I did not give him any feedback.
Now, you have talked to Gene Licio, correct? Eugene Licio?
Oh, yes, sir.
And he's noted in the same field you're in, correct?
Yes, sir.
Pretty proficient guy, has talked to you a number of times about your studies, exchange information back and forth.
Yes, sir.
Did you ever take a class with him?
I was in a conference with him a few months ago where he was actually speaking and I was speaking on a different subject.
Highly respected guy in this field, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, would you be able to show the jury the path in which Mr. Santana took?
We could move it over there and give an idea of where he was walking. I can't tell you exactly where he was walking.
And could you give them an idea of how far he walked from the first time he stated he first saw Mr. Scott?
I would not be able to do that due to not knowing where he was standing in the beginning.
So that information hasn't been communicated to you? I mean, you just receive it and then you put in the machine whatever people tell you, correct?
Pretty much, yes, sir.
Did they tell you where Mr. Santana was standing when he filmed?
No, sir, I was not told.
Would it be helpful for the jury to see the angle in which Mr. Santana filmed and then compare that to the view of Mr. Slager at the time of the incident?
Possibly.
Because different angles give different distances, correct? If I move laterally, you can tell that I'm moving laterally, right?
Sure.
And if I move longitudinally, it's more difficult to tell, correct?
Sure.
So could you take us on a virtual tour to show us what Mr. Santana saw, and then come around and show us what Officer Slager saw?
As in looking back towards
As
Santana?
in Mr. Santana, as in Mr. Slager getting up from the fight, and what he saw from that position.
No, sir, not unless I knew where he was.
Did they tell you where he was standing in photographs that Sled took at the time he got up, or they didn't tell you that?
I'm not sure where, I wasn't told exactly where he was standing, no, sir.
Were you told in this case the most important view is the view that Officer Slager had at the time he went for lethal force?
No one specifically.
Calls for expertise outside of this.
Just asked him if he was given information.
The objection is sustained.
Were you ever told where Mr. Slager was standing so you could get his view as opposed to Mr. Santana's view?
No, sir.
But certainly somebody with your expertise and your qualifications, such as Eugene Lisfield, could actually take a virtual tour for the jury and look from Mr. Slager's eyes to what he saw.
I don't know his qualifications. We do not do crime scene reconstruction.
But the Faro scan gives you the ability to move around the crime scene to look at it from different angles, does it not?
That is very true.
And one of the angles would be where Officer Slager was standing and what he could see.
One of those angles would be in there, yes, sir.
And anyone who would do that could rely on your original Faro scans to use that same information to do that, correct?
That would fall under their expertise.
And the FBI, you mentioned that you were called off from duty on April 20th because the FBI was coming.
Not that they were coming, just that it was unknown who was going to complete the scans.
You traveled from Columbia down here,
Correct.
and then Angela Peterson told you to shut it down.
Tell me that we were unsure who was going to be completing the scans.
Have you seen the FBI scan?
No, sir, I have not.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Just briefly, thank you. Mr. Town, I'm about 17 feet away from you. Does that seem about right to you?
Approximate from where you pulled the measuring tape earlier.
Can you see my back from there?
Yes, sir.
Do you need a Faro scan to demonstrate that?
No, sir.
Okay.
That's an informative question.
And
The,
Objection is informed.
all right. He's already answered the question, and the objection is overruled.
both sides have had access to this
Objection,
information.
informative question.
All right, don't lead the witness.
You provided the prosecution with this
Objection,
information.
informative question.
What's your first word to say? Did you provide the?
Did you provide this information to the state?
Yes, sir, I did.
Do you know approximately when that was provided?
The original video and web share, or what's just been entered?
What's been introduced, all of that?
I do not know exactly when the original ones were turned over. That was much earlier on. However, this one was turned over a few weeks ago due to a request from Mr. Eugene Liscio.
And the originals, you said some time ago?
Yes, sir.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
All right. Anything further, Mr. Savage?
Yes, sir, thank you.
All right, thank you. You may step down.
Judge, may we vote?
Yes. All right. Ms. Wilson?
Yes, sir, Your Honor, state rest.
All right, the state rests subject to review of the exhibits. Ladies and gentlemen, the state has rested. That means you have heard the state's case. We need to have you go to the jury room while I take up some matters outside your presence. With regard to the exhibits, we can review that at the end of the day, or you can review it at the end of the day. The court still consider it.
Thank you.
All right, any matters of law from the state or the defense?
None from the state.
All right.
Your Honor, on behalf of Mr. Slager, we move for a direct verdict. Dismissal, the state has failed, even scintilla of evidence to show any malice in this matter. Your Honor has had an opportunity to view all the exhibits of the state, all the videos of the state. There's no indication at all that there was any malice prior to the shooting. We have accepted to the commission of any evidence of post-first shot, either video or other testimony. This is a premeditated accusation by the state of malice, and anything following that shooting is not relevant to the issue before the court. And that's what he's charged with. He was not charged with any lower offense, even though the state, in its open argument, argued for manslaughter, but there is no formal accusation of manslaughter, so I wouldn't address that at this time. But I do address the lack of malice aforethought, which is the essential element in the murder case, and therefore we would move for dismissal of the charges.
Says the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. Obviously, the central piece of evidence in this case from the beginning has been the video that you've seen several times, Your Honor, clearly depicting Officer Slager shooting Mr. Scott in the back as he runs away. To be brief, I'm tempted to stop there. I won't, but I believe that in and of itself, in view of how you sit now, Your Honor, viewing this in the light most favorable to the state, certainly satisfies the any evidence standard of malice. However, that isn't all we have. We also have Officer Slager's several misstatements, what we would characterize as outright lies as to what had occurred between him and Mr. Scott until led several days following this repeated. We have the near immediate grabbing of the taser and what we would categorize as the staging of this scene. That sort of behavior that quickly after the shooting certainly is reflective of a guilty conscience, reflective of the previous malice. As to premeditation, as was argued in opening, as Your Honor is aware, murder in South Carolina does not require that the state prove any degree of premeditation as far as prior planning. That what Mr. Savage referred to as premeditation under South Carolina law, as you know, can happen in an instant. We also have the inference from the deadly weapon, using it this many times, and I would, respectfully disagree with the defense that the number of shots is irrelevant. I think certainly it is irrelevant, and including the pause between the 7th and 8th shot that we've heard testimony about. We've got the numbers of shots, their location to his back, him running up to the body and yelling, "Hands behind your back," angrily right after the shooting. Again, we think in sort of a verbal indication of staging a scene to make it seem like it was different than it actually was. We think, Your Honor, again, in a light most favorable to the state, as you're aware, you said now that more than meets our legal requirements for malice in this case.
Mr. Savage?
If I may, the state ignores the fact that Officer Slager was working as a police officer at the time. So the court's view of his actions on that day cannot be viewed the same as a Saturday night killing or a typical murder case, but must be viewed through the eyes of a reasonable police officer at the time he determined to use lethal force.
That's per what South Carolina authority?
Fourth Circuit, Your Honor.
I said per what South Carolina authority?
You had some data case on that in South Carolina, so we looked at the Fourth Circuit guidance, and there are innumerable cases arising in the Fourth Circuit.
Criminal cases?
Civil cases.
Civil cases?
Yes. These are unusual cases where the state would allege murder for a police officer operating within the scope of his employment at the time of the killing. So one cannot just focus on a traditional murder charge, but must look at it through the experience of the officer and the experience of the victim immediately prior to the shooting. And I think the court's well aware of the efforts made, the level of force that was employed all the way along, all of the threats, not just of Mr. Scott, but the unknowns, the unknown who the passenger was, where he was, the unknown who the phone he was giving directions to, the unknown of whether he was armed or not armed, a reasonable police officer not having given an opportunity to frisk a suspect. It's reasonable to believe that somebody who acted as aggressively as he did, in failure to obey the uniform, that failure to obey the verbal commands, failure to obey taser warnings, failure to obey the remarks made during the course of the fight that the state has not produced the audio of. Not that the verbal threat or verbal statement is significant in terms of allowing somebody to use lethal force, but the combination of events from the time Mr. Slager approached Mr. Scott's car until the time of the lethal shot, in this case involving the police officer and the scope of his duties, must be considered and not ignored.
Mr. Simpson?
To the degree that, obviously we're going to have a charge conference at a later date, but to the degree any of those questions are applicable to the facts of this case, those are all jury determinations. A determination of reasonableness is one to be made by a jury. And again, we sit here at this juncture just looking for any evidence whatsoever of malice. I think for the reasons previously discussed, the state has more than met its burden for a direct verdict. These considerations discussed by Mr. Savage are those properly made by a jury, and that's why we should proceed past the direct verdict.
The defendant, Michael Thomas Slager, is charged with murder. The state has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant killed another person with malice aforethought. Malice is defined in the law as being hatred, ill will, or hostility towards another person. It's the intentional doing of a wrongful act without just cause or excuse, and with an intent to inflict an injury or under circumstances that the law will infer an evil intent. Malice aforethought does not require that malice exists for any particular time before the act is committed, but malice must exist in the mind of the defendant just before and at the time of the act that the act is committed. There must be a combination of previous evil intent and the act, and malice aforethought may be expressed or inferred from circumstances. At the close of the state's case, the defendant may move for a directed verdict, and on motion of the defendant or on the court's own motion, the court shall direct the verdict in the defendant's favor. After the evidence is closed on either side, if there is a failure of competent evidence tending to prove the charge in the indictment, in ruling on the motion, the trial judge shall consider only the existence or non-existence of the evidence and not its weight. When ruling on a motion for directed verdict, a court is concerned, a trial court is concerned with the existence of the evidence, not its weight. In this case, the evidence in the record indicates that if believed by the jury, indicates that the defendant shot the victim, and construing this evidence in the light most favorable to the state as I'm required, shows the defendant shot the victim in the back while running away. The jury can infer an evil intent, the jury can infer hostility, the jury can infer malice, and we have the additional factor of the use of a deadly weapon. At this stage of the proceedings, malice can be inferred through the use of a deadly weapon. And of course, that inference may change depending on what defense is offered, if any. I respectfully deny the motion. This is a matter in which the court cannot and will not grant a directed verdict, and the motion is denied.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, we ready to press on?
Yes, sir.
All right.
I think we need a little bit of time to get set up for the next,
Okay.
if that's possible.
5 minutes, 10 minutes? 10 minutes? All right, good. 10 minutes, we'll be in recess.